Magic, the most controversial topic amongst the Total War community. On the one hand, you have the Warhammer enjoyers shooting lightning and racking up thousands of kills. On the other, you have the historical diehards screaming cheese. I'm called Khorne, and today I'm gonna be making a guide on how to use magic in Total War Warhammer 3. I will try to showcase how to use spells from every single lore magic there is, go over in which situations I think they would be useful in, and lastly, I will be ranking them all based on their usefulness. I will rank them in one of four categories. Overpowered, where I think these lores of magic are extremely strong and versatile, basically useful in every single situation. Strong, where I think these lores of magic are fairly useful in almost every situation, or they excel in a particular area, like dishing out damage. Mediocre, these lores don't really excel in anything or are just a little bit underwhelming. And weak, where I would recommend you avoid using these lores of magic if you have other options available. To begin, let's just briefly go over Winds of Magic and how it functions. At the bottom right of your screen, you will notice an hourglass shape with a number in the lower part of it. That number represents the amount of Winds of Magic you currently have available to pay for casting a spell, while the upper part of the hourglass represents the amount of Winds of Magic you can still get over the course of a battle. Every 9 seconds, you'll get 1 Winds of Magic transferred from your reserves to the pool from which you can use it for casting spells. You can always increase the rate at which you get reserves transferred by getting skills such as Arcane Conduit. Next, let's give you a quick rundown on the different kinds of spells there are, how they work, and share with you some tricks that you can use when casting them. First, let's go over every kind of spell there is. You have augments that are basically just buffs or debuffs. Then you have heals, which, surprise, they heal your units. You have direct damage spells, meaning they dish out damage to a unit it is cast on or units in a designated area. You have magic missiles, which are basically like an artillery shot made of magic. You have breath or wind spells, which is a damage dealing spell that usually goes in a straight line and dishes out damage to any unit it touches. Then you have explosion spells, which, as it sounds, creates an explosion that damages every unit caught by it. Bombard spells that usually drop something from the sky in an area, damaging anything that gets hit. And vortex spells, which is usually a randomly moving vortex that dishes out damage to any unit caught inside of it. Pretty much every spell in the game will fall under one of these categories. There are also lore passives, which are like miniature spells that trigger whenever you cast. And depending on the lore magic, they each have a different effect. When it comes to actually casting spells, most spells in the game can either be normal cast or overcast. Overcasting a spell means that spell will get an additional effect, such as prolonged duration or increased damage. But you will have to pay more Winds of Magic to cast it, it will go on a longer cooldown, and there is also a 50% chance of having the spell quite literally blow up in your face. I will eventually go over every individual spell in the game and tell you if I think it is worth overcasting or not. And just as a side note, you can actually avoid getting damaged by the miscast explosion if you have a speed higher than 80, where you basically just outrun it. And lastly, if you have multiple spellcasters of the same lore magic, and you want to cast an augment, heal, or direct damage spell on the same target on which you have already cast the exact same spell, you need to be aware that all you are doing is resetting the spell duration, not actually adding to it. So usually, you'll want to wait out the duration of one cast before casting the spell again. You can, however, actually stack the same spell twice on the same target, if you overcast that spell, as technically, it is not considered to be the same. This usually, in most cases, isn't really worth doing, and it's probably only good when you're in an emergency situation and need to deal with an enemy quickly rather than effectively. So that was the very basics of casting spells in this game. Now let's go over some actual lores of magic, and to start off with, for the video, I have arbitrarily chosen to cover the lores of death, shadows, beasts, and fire, as I think these are the most common lores of magic you'll find in the game. So let's talk about the Lore of Death first. And the Lore of Death is a pretty useful lore of magic designed to dish out a decent amount of damage and debuff the enemy. Its lore passive, Life Leeching, is also one of the better lore passives in the game, where it will provide you with 2.5 winds of magic over the course of 25 seconds. So if you wait a full 25 seconds after casting a spell, that spell will actually be 2.5 winds of magic cheaper. Next, let's talk about your first spell, which is Spirit Leech. A single target direct damage spell, which is pretty decent at killing low health single entities, but pretty bad at killing regular units. It is a spell you will usually only use in the beginning of your campaign to deal with enemy lords or heroes, but as the game progresses, the spell will become a lot less impactful. I would suggest you avoid casting this spell on single entities with a lot of health, a lot of spell resistance, or if the enemy has regeneration, as in those cases, you're usually just wasting your winds of magic. And Spirit Leech? Well, it isn't cheap. Overcasting this spell is usually pretty worthless, as the only thing it does is give you extra range to cast it. But if you have multiple spellcasters of death, you can do the neat little trick we have talked about earlier, which is to basically cast the spell twice on the same target, and dish out more damage over a shorter period of time. For a single player, this is basically worthless unless you're in a real hurry to kill an enemy general. Then we have the aspect of the Dread Knight, which is a fairly useless spell. It is a buff spell that gives Fear and Terror, 8 leadership, as well as magic attack to a single unit when normal cast, or in an area when overcast. The Fear and Terror side of the spell are fairly useless unless you're fighting against low tier trash. The leadership buff is kind of negligible, and the only thing that is actually good about this spell is the fact that it gives you magic attack, which can be very helpful if you're going up against units with high physical resistance. Then we have Doom and Darkness, a debuff spell that lowers enemy leadership by 16, which is a decent enough spell if you can combine it with other leadership reducing effects. Or if you time it at just the perfect moment when the enemy unit is low enough on leadership that it will actually break. It will affect a single unit when normal cast or an area when overcast, making it so you will always want to be overcasting this spell. I usually don't find myself casting this spell all that often, but if you can get a good cast in, it can be fairly devastating on the battlefield. Next we have Soul Blight, and this is a fairly strong spell, especially for factions that love to blob up. The spell reduces enemy weapon strength by 25% and armor by 30%, making it so they perform much worse in a melee grind. And usually, this is a spell that works really well in combination with blobs or units that are designed to outlast their enemy in melee, as it lets your units live much longer and lets them dish out even more damage. The next spell is going to be Fate of Buna, and this is one that is rather devastating in multiplayer, but kind of completely useless in single player. It is a single target, direct damage spell that is designed to drain a unit of its health. The problem with it though, is that it is extremely expensive to cast, and Purple Sun is generally just a much better spell. It is primarily used to destroy a high value cavalry unit, such as a Grail Knight. And finally we have Purple Sun, a really good vortex spell that is absolutely amazing at killing both trash and elite infantry. I would recommend you usually not overcast the spell, even though it costs just a little bit of extra wins to double its duration. This is because unless you can get a really big blob going with the enemy units, you usually will just overkill the enemy and end up wasting its duration. You're also going to be risking miscasting the spell, and you will be increasing its cooldown. Overall, Lore of Death is really good when it comes to dishing out damage and debuffing your enemies. But it isn't really amazing at doing either of these things, so while it is fairly versatile, I will have to say that it is overall mediocre. Next lore of magic we will be talking about will be the Lore of Shadows, which is fairly similar to the Lore of Death in the sense that it is designed to both dish out damage and debuff the enemy. But it also has a pretty good buff for your own army. Its lore passive, Smoke and Mirrors, gives your entire army 10% increased movement speed for 24 seconds, which, unless you are using cavalry-focused armies, is gonna be fairly worthless for you. Then the first spell we will be talking about will be Melkov's Mystifying Miasma, which is a fairly worthless spell to say the very least. It is a direct damage spell that will affect only a single unit. And unlike Spear Leech, this spell is designed to damage units rather than single entities. Unfortunately, the spell costs a little bit too much for what it does, and I would just recommend you not use it unless you absolutely have no other options available. Then we have Enfeebling Foe, which is an amazing debuff spell that lowers enemy melee attack and melee defense by 24, which is a huge amount. It does affect only a single unit and is best used when going up against enemy characters, especially legendary lords that are melee experts. Now, I wouldn't really recommend overcasting this spell, but you can of course cast a single cast and overcast on a character to lower their stats by 48, which will in a lot of cases make it so that one of their stats is basically 0. I would usually use this spell in duels or when ganging up on an enemy character with your single entities to get the most value out of it. Then we have the Withering, which lowers enemy armor by 30 and leadership by 8. Overall, not that good a spell, as it is a worse version of Soul Blight, and I would definitely recommend you not cast this one. The only time when I think I might actually cast this spell is when you have range units that have low armor piercing damage and you're going up against a heavily armored enemy. Then we have Penumbral Pendulum, which I have to say is a terrible spell. This spell just does way too little damage and is way too expensive to be any good. So my advice is just never cast this spell. Next we have Occam's Mind Razor, and this is a pretty decent buff spell that provides you with 50% weapon strength and magic attack, making it decent against anything with high health and lots of physical resistance. Finally, we have Pit of Shades, which is one of the best Vortex spells in the game. One reason for this is because it is stationary, meaning it won't just randomly wander off and waste its damage, and if you overcast it, which I would always suggest you do, it does enough damage to pretty much completely kill almost any infantry unit you cast it on. Overall, Lore of Shadows is a lot less versatile than the Lore of Death, but it is pretty good when it comes to dishing out damage with the Pit of Shades. It has a pretty decent buff spell with Occam's Mind Razor, and it can help out a lot when it comes to dueling enemy characters with Enfeebling Foe. So, I will place it as mediocre as well. Next, let's talk about the Lore of Beasts, which unlike Shadows and Death, mostly focuses on buffing and debuffing units. Its lore passive, Wild Heart, gives you 80% recharge rate for 25 seconds, which can help when it comes to using up your Winds of Magic reserves, especially if you have no other way of increasing your recharge rate. First spell we will be talking about is Wissan's Wild Form, which is a pretty decent buff spell that provides you with 25% weapon strength and 30 armor. It affects a single unit if you normal cast it, and an area if you overcast it. So I would suggest that you always overcast this spell. Now, I don't actually think this spell is all that useful though, and is probably best used when you want to buff a single entity Monster Doom stack. But aside from that, I wouldn't really recommend using it. Then we have the Flock of Doom, a area of effect damage spell that does a decent amount of damage to enemy units. It's nothing special, and you will have to cast it a lot to get good value from it. But if you aren't in a hurry to dish out damage, such as if you're blobbing up, it can be a pretty good spell option. Next we have Pan's Impenetrable Pelt, which is a really good defensive spell, so long as you aren't going up against demons. It provides you with 20% physical resistance, 25% speed, and 24 melee defense. Normal casting affects only a single unit, while overcasting it gives it an area of effect. So once again, I would suggest you always overcast this spell. It is pretty good when you're running a monstrous Doom stack and want to keep them from taking damage, or when you need your front line to hold out just a little bit longer. Then we have the Amber Spear, a magic missile spell, which is honestly not that great. It is decent-ish in dealing damage to single entities, much like Spear Leech, but unless you can stack up a lot of spell mastery, it is gonna be very underwhelming. Overcasting it does double the damage for less winds of magic, but there's always the problem of miscasting, as well as the much longer cooldown. A big issue with this spell is also line of sight. Namely, this is one spell you will categorize as extremely janky, just because you will need perfect line of sight not to miss the enemy you're targeting. So it is usually best not to use this spell unless your spellcaster is flying and you can get directly above the enemy to ensure you always hit. Next we have the Curse of Anraher, which is a pretty good area of effect debuff spell, reducing enemy melee attack and melee defense by 24, speed by 25%, and accuracy by 30. Which, just like Pan's Impenetrable Belt, can make it so your front line lives a bit longer and does some more damage. But this spell is probably best used, again, with single entity blobs, to dish out damage faster and take less in turn. You can also use it to duel enemy characters, just like you would Enfeebling Foe. Now, you can overcast this spell to extend the area of effect, but I don't really think that is ever gonna be necessary. Finally, we have the Transformation of Khorne, which will summon a Manticore onto the battlefield, but it only has 2 uses. This can be pretty useful, especially for harassing the enemy backline or slowing down an enemy on approach, and letting your range units fire for longer. Unfortunately, the summon doesn't really last a long time, and it will get killed almost instantly, so it will pretty much never get any value done in terms of damage. And just as a fun fact about this spell, but not every race will actually summon a Manticore. Namely, the High Elves and Wood Elves will summon an Eagle, and the Vampire Counts with their Bloodline Lords can summon a Vargulf. Overall, not that bad of a lore of magic, and it definitely has some uses to it, but it isn't that useful in most situations, and as such I will have to place it as weak, as it is probably best used when running a single entity doom stack. And lastly, let's talk about the Lore of Fire, which is one of the most destructive lores of magic in the game. Its lore passive, Kindle Flame, makes every enemy unit on the battlefield take 20% extra fire damage for 15 seconds, which, as you might have guessed, is extremely useful when you're using fire to incinerate your enemy. Your first spell, Fireball, is however just terrible. It is a magic missile that does low damage already, but it is also one of the jankiest spells in the game. As if there is even a slight misalignment with your target, you will end up hitting the ground. So the best way to use this spell, which I would recommend not doing, is to either get up high on a hill and try to cast it from there, or to cast it only if you have a flying spellcaster. I would also advise you never ever overcast this spell, as it is both not worth it, and if it does miss, you are wasting twice the winds of magic. Then you have Cascading Firecloak, which is a buff spell that gives you 24 melee defense and 25% armor-piercing weapon strength. This is a pretty good and cheap buff spell that you will usually want to cast on your characters to help them survive in melee for longer. Next we have Flaming Sword Ruin, which is a okay-ish area of effect buff spell that gives your units fire and magic attack, as well as increasing your base weapon strength and missile strength by 30%. Honestly, the only use for this spell is to provide you with magic attack for targets with high physical resistance, or fire damage against the occasional unit with weakness to fire. But aside from those 2 situations, I wouldn't really recommend you cast the spell. And now we have finally come to the good stuff. First up, Burning Head. A wind spell that will go down a straight-ish line. Don't let the indicator fool you, I had this spell once make a 90-degree turn into my own army. It is pretty decent at dishing out damage to anything that is unarmored, and it also applies the Burnt debuff, which makes it the ideal spell when going up against low-tier trash. Usually, the best way to cast this spell is to do it once your front lines have engaged and the enemy blobs up around your units. Now, it is a pretty good spell in the early game, but I have found that once a unit has 80 or more armor, this spell becomes basically worthless to cast. I wouldn't really recommend overcasting it either, as it does 50% more damage for a 60% increase in cost. Then we have Piercing Bolts of Burning, which is a pretty decent bombard spell, but it is rather bad to cast versus infantry. It is, however, really good against large units, such as cavalry or big monsters. The only downside to this spell is the fact that it has a small strike area, which makes it rather easy for the enemy to dodge it. I would definitely recommend that you always overcast this spell, as it does more damage, and I would only ever use it if you have tied down the enemy first. Lastly, we have Firestorm, which is one of the best Vortex spells in the game, as it lasts a rather long time and does a lot of damage to almost any infantry unit. If you overcast this spell, you will double its duration, and it is worth doing, but in most cases I just find it to be completely overkill, and I would just recommend that you normal cast it. Overall, Lore of Fire is an extremely potent, damage-dealing lore of magic, with some minor but useful buffs, and a decent amount of versatility. So I will place it as a strong lore of magic. And that is gonna have to be it for this one. I was planning to do a single video for every single lore of magic in the game, but for just 4, it took me way more time than I had expected. So I will probably cover about 4 lores of magic per video. So if you want to see a particular lore of magic next, tell me which one you want in the comments. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to subscribe for future content. Thank you all for watching, and until next time.
Khorne fights as one.